Life is good. Life is good. Life is good. You may disagree with that simple statement, regardless of how it's said. But those three little words are registered and trademarked expressions by the life is good people, for whom life is pretty good. You've probably seen the Life is Good logo on T-shirts, it's on coffee mugs, and the likes at Frisbees. Life is Good is this. Their logo is this little stick figure, very simple and primitive, named Jake. And he wears a black beret, he has these beatnik sort of sunglasses on, and he flashes this giant Cheshire cat grin. And it is a picture of him is pictured at the bottom of your worship bulletin on the inside there. Jake is oftentimes posed in any number of activities that bring simple pleasures to life. Hiking, surfing, flying a kite, perhaps walking the dog, and the likes. Since 1994, people have been drawn to this rather simple and optimistic philosophy of life, so much so that the sincere and optimistic slogan has become a $100 million a year merchandising line, sold by about 4,500 distributors in some 14 countries. Jake gets around. One key to the success of this particular line of merchandise seems to be what it says about the owner or the wearer of a particular item. So someone that's wearing a Jake kayaking with his dog perhaps on board, it announces to those walking by what this individual, what brings them pleasure, but also what is a hobby or interest of theirs as well. It's really what makes for them a good life. But the popularity of this particular campaign is beyond the hobbies, advertising hobbies and interests of folks. Cancer sufferers and survivors have also embraced this mantra in a line that's due to its simple philosophy, that life is good. And it has become the hopeful battle cry for those who are afflicted with cancer, but also a celebration theme for cancer survivors. The founders of Life is Good, Bert and John Jacobs, two brothers who were literally, just prior to introducing Jake, were living in their van down by the river in Boston. They're quick to note the humility of their assumption and their assertion that life isn't perfect, it isn't great, but it can be good. They know that there's plenty of bad out in the world, and their philosophy and attempt is to focus on the good, not on the bad. And so the slogan is an affirmation, they say, of the here and now, and I quote them, "Don't determine that you're going to be happy when you get the new car, or the big promotion, or you meet that someone special. You can decide that you're going to be happy today." It's not scriptural, but I think it's certainly biblical. And in case you're wondering, yes, the Life is Good people have a competitor. It is also a registered trademark expression, and that the title of the competitor, the name of the competitor is Life is Crap. And to tell you the truth, that might be a better way to describe what the early Christians of our text were experiencing as the church got off to a pretty rough start. Immediately before this passage, everything seems to be going fairly well. There's these profound thoughts and revelations and epiphanies about God. They're praying for the Holy Spirit. There are quotes from the Old Testament that are underscoring that this truly was the Messiah in Jesus Christ. And then all of a sudden, without warning, it sort of shifts the narrative to this kind of practical matter. It's almost as though the afterglow of Easter is beginning to slightly diminish as there are clouds developing on the horizon, clouds of persecution, and threatens to overshadow the remaining Easter glow. And so here they are, 11 disciples now, because one of them, Judas, has committed suicide. They're hunkered down in Jerusalem together, probably in that upper room where they shared that last meal with Jesus. They're wondering what's next now that their beloved rabbi and friend Jesus has ascended into heaven. And while the promise is coming of Pentecost, the bringing of a new power to their lives, it's also going to bring some new persecutions that they are beginning to be aware of. As you read through the book of Acts, it kind of reads through like a police report in one of the roughest cities of the neighborhoods in the city. In chapter 4, Peter and John get arrested, and eventually all of the apostles are arrested. They're flogged, and they're even given preaching restraining orders in the 5th chapter. The 7th chapter, we read about Stephen, who becomes the first martyr. He is stoned to death for his faith. The church is persecuted and driven out of Jerusalem by chapter 8. In chapter 9, Paul gets a death warrant on him, a bounty on his head. And in chapter 12, James loses his head. He's beheaded. And this goes on and on and on. So after reading all of that, you might think, well, wait a minute, life isn't good. Life is bad. Bad. Really bad. But it wasn't for them. It was still a good life for the apostles. Not my words, but theirs, recorded for us. So it begs the question, how can it be said of anyone who's part of a group that's been arrested and threatened? They've been put in prison, they've been beaten, and have even been killed. How can life be good when all that is going on in their life? The key, I think, is into the bonding that they experienced. They bonded together in several different ways, and it was more than this misery loves company where, we're grieving still the loss of our dear Jesus, or that all these horrendous things that are happening to us and to our families even, and we're just going to commiserate with one another. It was more than that. They held out 3 things that they shared in common that seemed to intensify this bonding with one another. And all 3 are reflected in our text this morning. Despite facing some dreadful religious persecutions, the early church shared a common purpose, a common place, and common possessions, which helped them to not just cope with the situation they were finding themselves, but to thrive at the same time, to thrive. The common purpose that they shared. It replaced this idea of just all about me, this individualism, with a much bigger, broader picture. And not a picture that was created out of their imagination or their fantasy or what they wanted to help edify them, but one that was based upon shared biblical values. Verse 32 says that now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. One heart and soul. A church historian has noted that was really the defining characteristic of the unity of the early church, that it wasn't just we share one thing in common, one tiny aspect of our life, but they shared all of their life with one another. In fact, of this, Wayne Meeks, this historian, writes, one peculiar thing about early Christianity was the way in which the intimate, close-knit life of the local groups was seen to be simultaneously part of a much larger, indeed ultimately worldwide movement or entity. The kerygma, a Greek word meaning proclamation of the early church, told the story of Jesus and his teachings. And those teachings gave these small nuclear groups, if you will, of Christians a new mission statement. And along with that mission statement, they organized themselves in a radically different way than they had ever met or experienced something before. Certainly different than their non-believing neighbors and perhaps even family members, and certainly of the larger culture. In the 2nd chapter of Acts, it talks about that these new believers took to heart the teachings of the apostles. They fellowshiped both in the temple and in their homes in secret. They witnessed miracles. They praised God with hymns. And they saw additional converts coming to them every day, we're told. That's an effective small group. And even today in the small group movement, that's the kind of goal that these groups work towards. That it's not just this superficial, a few things that we share in common or just a gathering even of acquaintances, but a deep, intimate bonding. They not only shared a common purpose, they also shared a common place, which might be easy to miss because we don't necessarily think of a place being an instrument of bonding or bringing us together. And yet, if we think about it, perhaps in the routines of our life, we do just that. They were replacing this isolation and withdrawal from the world and from their world with true fellowship, with folks that they shared a lot in common with. And so it was sort of a renewed focus upon community within even defined neighborhoods. I think we're a little less interested in this because technology has expanded those that we can reach out to, and it's changed our circles of relationships to global, really. We can call, we can text, we can email each other, we can drive or fly to see somebody on the other side of the continent or the other side of the world. But it's awfully hard to put into practice the principles of Christianity, the teachings of Christ, long distance. In fact, there's something about it that just doesn't kind of feel right. When we're not living in close proximity to others, we're not able to be there at hand when they need us. Because life doesn't happen on a schedule. It doesn't come conveniently. Crises crop up at a moment's notice. When we share a common place, there's this sort of spontaneity that happens. We may not think a whole lot about this crossing of paths unintentionally. You go down to Mark's or to Heinen's to purchase something, and you run into a neighbor or a friend, and you catch up. You perhaps celebrate with them in some good news or offer to pray for them when it's bad news. Eating a local eatery, the same. Or sometimes just being home, and suddenly there's a knock on the door, and it's somebody on the back porch hollering, "Hey, anybody home? We were just in the neighborhood. We thought we'd stop in." We'd drop in, unannounced. Who does that today? But do you remember back in the day when that was common practice? And hospitality was there for you. By being in close proximity, there's also kind of an availability that arises, of being close enough, again, to lend an ear or a hand when needed, to an immediate need, and not having to wait until you're able to drive to that place or to fly in. This fourth chapter of Acts, in context, takes place at the Jerusalem church, just before something called the diaspora happens. That is in Acts 8, and it's where the temple leaders and other community leaders wanted to squelch these followers of Jesus. Enough with it. He's dead and gone. Let's move on. And so they pushed to spread them, to scatter them, and to get them out of Jerusalem, which really just infests the rest of the known world, is the way that the Lord uses that diaspora, that scattering of people. But in verse 32, it says, everything they owned was held in common. You can only do that if you happen to live in close geographic proximity. You can't do it if you're in another state or such to share things. And so the thought here is that if we want to develop deeper relationships with one another of a first century kind of church, we don't need to look very far. In fact, we need to just look next door or to look around us where we are right now, looking to build community within the community. They shared a common purpose. They shared a common place. Okay, and here comes the one that's really controversial. It's probably one of the most staggering features of the early church, but it is also the primary focus of our passage this morning. Common possessions. These folks replaced ownership with sharing. What were they thinking? Giving stuff away with a smile on our face. Really? What? Who does that? Well, it happened at least once that we know of, as recorded here for us. These verses of Acts 4, 32 to 37, and Kay was not responsible for the typo there, it was me. We're on through verse 37. It's been the center of a lot of attention. Certainly over recent decades, discussions of, is this kind of talking about Christian socialism or Christian communism, if you will? And there is a similarity between those two philosophies, the Christian thought and communism or socialism. In verse 35, it talks about that these resources were distributed to each as any had need. Karl Marx modifies that a little bit with saying, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. There are some scholars who question whether this practice of the Jerusalem church was simply recounted here as sort of a failed experiment and then moving on to something else, or if this really is an ideal of the kingdom that we are supposed to be practicing and reintroducing into the Christian faith. At first glance, Luke, who is identified as the author of the book of Acts, his account of this particular practice seems pretty straightforward. Anyone who owned lands or houses, but it says from time to time, sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. It was the proceeds were brought so that it could be made available to others for distribution, for simple distribution, probably through coinage. And it was confirmed by a very specific example at the tail end of this passage of Barnabas, who sold a field that he owned and belonged to him, and then he brought the money to the apostles, we're told. In just a few more verses, there's a pretty dramatic experience going to happen about some folks who brought their resources to the larger group, but there's some things they held back on. And I would encourage you later on to read that. Not right now. Stay with me just for a few more moments, and then you can catch that dramatic instance. But through that, it suggests that there was no universal expectation that folks just turned everything they had over to the larger group and that everyone worked from a common purse, so to speak. More likely, I think the description of what was going on here is the cultural context that stems from that phrase that appears twice in here. They laid it at the apostles' feet. In the ancient world, that was really a way of recognizing and saying, I am under your authority, and what I place before you, I am giving over to you for your use or guidance and direction of what to do with it. It recognized the responsibility of the members of the community to provide for the needs of others, but also that the apostles had that authority to direct and sort of manage those distributions. It wasn't up to the individual. Thus, it appears the goal of all of this, although not always achieved, was that everyone's needs would be met. Not everyone's wants, but everyone's needs would be met. And that there was no expectation of the loss of private ownership or control, nor a goal of blending together all of this stuff. That was not an unknown way of living in the ancient world. Even with the Greeks, the Hellenistic worldview, there were two very fundamental traits that were associated with this bonding of true friendship. Number one was that nobody considered their personal possessions to be just their own. And secondly, those resources were always to be available for the common good, because friendship was ideally a bond that forged the parties into one soul. Those who recognize that they are one souls with another also recognize the needs of others and probably are more attentive to those needs than they would have been otherwise. And so that one would no more withhold their resources from somebody else who needs it, because they saw that as a blessing from God, something they were simply a steward of, not an owner, than they would one withhold from one's own resources for their own personal needs. It doesn't seem that there's any other way that that happens apart from God. Shared stuff, where you give as you can, you take as you need. With the idea or the mentality that I own nothing, and yet we own everything that we need. That was a radical thought then and even now. We may think that it was a lot easier for these ancients to share their stuff because they had so little. They didn't have stockpiles of things. Quite the contrary, I think it was perhaps even harder because they had so little. And to share a piece of bread made question whether they were going to be eating the next day. All of this said, lest any of you think that I am pointing fingers here or making judgment calls on any one of you, I am not. I have shared with you before, I preach to myself. If someone else benefits, that's great, but it's selfish. It's about me. And I'm a guy that has lots of stuff, as I've also confessed to you before. But I sense, especially this morning, that I'm not alone. And especially as you head up into the fellowship hall for coffee hour, take a look at the stage. It is packed with stuff. And we are just one small church in a small community. Holding our stuff in common is just, we think, okay, maybe in an ideal world we could do that, but not here, not now, especially in the West. I think, try not to think about that. And once in a while it's taken seriously within a church if there's a specific need. And I would applaud you and appreciate how generous this congregation is when there is an identified specific need. Oftentimes it is almost always oversubscribed to whatever the need was. In your generosity in wanting to help whatever the need might be. But on a larger scale, it's just not practical. Can you imagine during the Great Recession, and for some even still today, that a family would sell their summer vacation home just so their neighbor wouldn't lose their house? It sounds well and good, but that's not really our job. That's the government's job to take care of those folks. Nobody can be expected to live this way, and is described in Acts 4. Developing an Acts 4 community requires Christians to believe that they're not the owners. They're simply the managers of what we have, of what God has entrusted to us. They're to be open to God's leading and how they should use and share that which God has given. Figuratively, sometimes even literally, laying those gifts at Christ's feet. Money and possessions then become really tools for others, to help others, not for just sustaining and indulging our own interests and wants. I can only imagine what it must have been like in those first few weeks and months of the early church when they were of one heart and mind and one purse. Our Lenten season may be over, but certainly our need for self-reflection daily never ends. And our Easter may be past, but not our need to rise each morning, resurrected in God's love and grace. So how do we get to the good life? The way we get anywhere else, one step at a time. And specifically this morning, the good life that we're talking about here, God's good life. Maybe today it's signing upstairs up to be a door greeter, or donating some more stuff to the rummage sale, or sharing tools with some young work campers, or filling a bag to feed a family, or opening your home to host members of a children's choir that will be coming later next month, or volunteering to serve where needed. That's just to name a few of these baby steps we might take to live an Acts 4 lifestyle. And that's just from the bulletin insert. We've come to believe that sharing is this deep sacrifice that we have to make. But if you've ever had the opportunity to share with somebody who truly needed it and benefited from it, then you know that it's not about a deep personal sacrifice. It's about a deep personal satisfaction of seeing someone whose life may be changed forever because of your thoughtfulness and generosity or just your presence and kind words. Truth is, sharing is the way to live the good life. A college professor observed it this way: if we needed things we couldn't buy, many of us would have more friendships. Chew on that one. If we needed things we couldn't buy, many of us would have more friendships. And if you're still feeling overwhelmed about this message this morning, then take Howard Thurman's advice. Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and then go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. It's not even Easter and another resurrection. That's the good life. Please rise.